So my name is TJ Adams, and I'm the VP of Product Development here, Product Management. And my career has been a bit all over the place. I've started out in IT. I worked at a company called LexisNexis way back when, and kind of evolved over to the AV space. Worked in some interesting software development companies in the past, eventually at Biamp, and then here. So I've been here about a little over 8 years. So that's my background. You know, my perspective, and I think our perspective, just looking out at the space and talking with a lot of our partners, is that there's still an enormous amount of demand. And in fact, that's exacerbating some of our supply, and you hear that all in this industry these days too, about supply chain constraints and products not being available. I think, you know, when it comes to business risk, certainly it's going to get heightened over the next couple of years, I believe, and we believe, you know, and certainly we're going to head into some headwinds with, you know, inflationary pressures, and supply issues are probably not going to let up for several more years, is our assessment. But the good news is that this industry is not a consumer industry where it's, you know, hand to mouth, and it really is a multi-year project cycle, and it really follows more of the construction cycle, and we see so much momentum there that in my view, it's going to be a couple of years that we see struggle through this to actually keep up with demand. And then you'll see more of a lull later where some of that new construction starts to kind of ebb because of that 2 or 3 year cycle that it takes to get a building out of the ground. And then the AV kit is always at the end, right? So I think that's what we'll see. And, you know, having been, I guess, in this space for 15, 18 years and working for different manufacturers, I've seen this happen before, even in some of the work, even during the Great Recession, as they call it. You know, we powered through that at the other place, and we've seen that same here, where we've seen, you know, pressures even through COVID. We wondered, okay, what's this going to do to our business? Well, oddly enough, it actually increased demand, right? So I think then as that construction cycle switches over, and then you do see a delay in investment now in new builds, that doesn't hit until 2 or 3 years from now. But then all the customers, the end customers, say, well, I guess I'm stuck here. I better refit my rooms. I better invest in some technology to make my current space work better for my people. And I think the other piece of that is with COVID, that's created a total different viewpoint on the office. What's the office for? I think that philosophical question is being asked directly now that you see some companies making their employees come back. Look at Elon Musk was the extreme example, like you have to go back to the office or you're out of here, right? Well, I don't think that's as extreme most places, but certainly everyone, including ourselves, are reevaluating what is the office for? What is a place of work? What is the purpose of it? And I think the early indicators look like it's not a place to actually do work, it's a place to go collaborate. And I think that's going to drive more and more business, even through, you know, recessionary period where you may not see as much new construction, but you're going to see a lot of renovation and retrofitting and you know, technology that's network-based, wireless-based, software-based. And it's not just us, we obviously fit those categories, but there's a lot of other companies that are evolving that way in the space. And I think this whole environment with supply constraints is actually accelerating some of that move away from bespoke hardware and bespoke product development that the AV industry is notorious for, frankly, of, you know, little fiefdoms of, hey, we do just audio or we just do this. Well, those days are going to change, and they were already changing before the pandemic. And I think now that all of these multi-factored pressure points that I just described, and probably more, are moving us towards, I think, a better place as an industry. It's probably going to accelerate our maturity and embracing more modern and mainstream technologies. You know, it's going to hopefully bring in more diversity into the industry, like we discussed off camera about, you know, how do we enable more diversity of thought in this space, and that includes, you know, women, it includes minority, it includes bringing them into our thinking and not just on the periphery. And I think, you know, generational change is happening in this industry too. You see more and more young people. So I think it's a grand mix of things, isn't it? And it's all going to change all of us as we move forward. If you look at the mainstream technology space that I think you're probably more privy to than just AV, and more from my past, but I follow these trends too externally to the AV space. You see a mix of consolidation happening, to your point, but even in that mix, as that consolidation occurs, it actually creates kind of a phoenixing effect where people decide they don't want to go to that big organization and they want to go start something new. And so you see that cycle happening where you see consolidation, then you see a lot more upstarts. Those upstarts have more agility, both on the technology front and less to lose in a sense. And so that's where I think a lot of innovation happens. So I think that's going to happen here too, in this industry. I see the interchange amongst the factors involved have been the pandemic. It's changed the currency of exchange, if you will, when it comes to employee retention and attraction. Now, it used to be, like you said, foosballs and tables and perks at the office. And and I've heard a little bit of talk about that in the space, like, oh, people need to attract their employees back. I'm kind of on the opposite end of that personally. My opinion is that people don't want to go back. People want the flexibility. That's the new currency. People want to have more balance in their lives. I think the pandemic has taught a lot of us, myself included, how much importance there is in relationships with people, your family, your friends, and not looking at that and taking it for granted and then just working your life away. And I think that has changed the dynamic, I think, in a more healthy way, generally speaking. And I think the companies that want to go back to normal are going to be woefully disappointed, because people today are now ready to say, nope, I'm going to go somewhere else. And I speak for ourselves, we're leaning into that. So even Q-SYS was sort of on the fence before the pandemic about hiring people in different locales. We always had development sites in different places, and we're like, you got to move here, or you got to do that. Now it's like, what? There's talent all over the place that don't want to move, but yet we would never get after or be able to attract to us unless we have that flexibility. And so that's my perspective on it. And it's an opinion, and I know there's a lot of wrestling with that topic in this space and wider world, but that's my take on it. So I think the factors to that question you asked me a second ago, I think it's how do you bring younger talent in? How do you kind of change the face of this industry to be a bit younger, a little bit more diverse? I think the pandemic has a big factor to that. Attracting the talent has a big factor to that. The companies that are more progressive and being flexible are going to bring in more of that young talent, because that younger generation or generations, they want this. That is the currency they want to exchange with their employer. The technology is another factor. And so this industry has always been very siloed, if you will, and the technology has been very bespoke, as I mentioned earlier. Audio companies, video companies, and there's a lot of pride in that development being invented there. I think that is against the trend of bringing in younger talent and people who are growing up in a world that's integrated, and not the way we think of it in this space, but the user experience aspects of their lives have been so consumerized with technology, and so it part of their intrinsics of their life since they were born. The last several generations grew up with the internet and VR and AI-based technologies, and the user experience of a phone and all of that. Not like me, I was right on the cusp of, I grew up without the internet. I didn't get it until I was in my 20s. So it's I think that's another factor, is the technology in this industry is boring to a lot of younger people. And so I think it's not the primary driver, but I think it should be a consideration for these companies in this space, is that you should evolve your technology not just because it's good for you as a business and that it's going to help solve customer problems with more mainstream modern technology, software-based, network-based, all of the things that IT space has been doing for decades, but also that will open the doors to more attractiveness to that younger group of people too. And I think those are the factors, I guess. That's how I see the world. It's been a lot of hand-wringing over, gosh darn it, if we could satisfy all this demand, we could be doing even more and we could be growing faster as an industry and in my business, and that pressure of the demand being so high and then not being able to satisfy it has been a lot of consternation, is the word I would use in this industry. Struggle with how do we work our way out of this, right? How do we actually satisfy the demand out there? That's been one. Another topic has been, isn't it strange to be back together again? Almost rusty. Like, how do we do this? How do we actually communicate? 2 years have gone by plus, and have we been partnering enough? Have we been connecting outside of ourselves enough? And that's definitely been a topic. I've had a lot of people come here and want to talk to us about how do we work more together? You guys don't do this, we do that. How do we work together to do something greater for the customer? I think that's been a lot of the discussions. The other is, how do we get away from some of this bespoke hardware that it's shown the intrinsic weakness of this space? And not just space, you see automotive has struggled too, and some other industries, but certainly this space is so hardware dependent. That's been the talk of, TJ, you guys talk a lot about software. We've been doing that for years. Q-SYS is a software-based platform. How did you guys do this? How did you guys move away from hardware to software? Those are the conversations I've had at the bars and drinks this week. I think the network's crystal ball is, how do we move away from being so reliant on these single sources of technology, I guess? A lot of the technology, especially in the audio side, was impacted by a fire at one manufacturer, AKM, and that created a cascading event. So a lot, as you can see, Q-SYS' roots are in audio, so a lot of my friends in this space are either other audio providers, people at Biamp, for instance, or folks over at IED, or those are all people I know and friends, and I actually haven't had a chance to talk to my friends over at Biamp this week because I've been so darn busy, but these companies, though, are the ones being impacted, and ourselves, by some of those supply chain issues that aren't even related to demand. It's because you have a single source of technology. And so how do you move away from that? And that's the second part of that conversation I mentioned, which is how does this industry move more towards software? And don't get me wrong, you still have to have hardware, but how do you, if you're going to use hardware, how do you use more mainstream hardware that the rest of the world is using, like Intel or, I don't know, ARM, or any of these kind of platforms that are more modern, that aren't bespoke, but they require more software engineering capability. So this industry has a lot of hardware engineering expertise. It's kind of how we move towards the software development expertise. I think that's the conversations I've had with some people privately. And I suspect that our friends in the industry and competitors that are friendly as well, I think they're all probably feeling the same thing, honestly. That's my take on it. So. Yeah. Even you can see it in the press. I mean, I did a chat with Audinate, and they invited me. I was honored to be there. They were doing a press engagement just yesterday, day before yesterday, talking about supply chain. And one of their themes was, TJ, you went down the software path with us. You used to be using our hardware modules. Now you decided to go develop with us. We partner with them to develop software, Dante. Would you come talk to this industry about the experience there and how great it's been? Because guess what? We haven't had a lot of those constraints on Audinate products because we've been able to ship software that runs on our cores. But underneath all of that is because we decided to go with more mainstream hardware platforms. So the story is not just about just software. I think that's a bit naive. This industry will never just be software. But how do we pick the right software technologies and underpinning hardware technologies that the wider world is expanding and growing and investing in? They're not investing in DACs, digital audio converters. They're investing in open platform hardware like Intel ASK86 and ARM that then you can write software to make that chip do whatever you want it to, more or less. And I think those are the nuances to this conversation that I think this industry is going to have to move along with. I have been really busy at this show, to be honest, and a lot of meetings, so I haven't done as much of a show walk, but I don't see anything yet that's really stood out to me very crisply, like, oh man, that's the next big thing. I think trend-wise, though, that we've been observing both here at the show and also just in our own experiences, not just QC experience, but like all of us, is the whole idea of collaboration and how do we improve that, and how do we create more meeting equity, because all of us have jobs that we work remotely, mostly in this space. So how do we now have this new world of hybrid work, having to go back to the office, but not full-time, and what's that office mean for us now, like as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, but then what the technology has to evolve to that, because the technology today, it's kind of on this break point of you either have online work that you do at home, and then you have meeting room technology. How do you make these two things play nice together? Because you're going to have people who are now more remote permanently, people you hire that aren't at one of your site offices, and then you have people who are collaborating, going to the office to actually meet. So I see that kind of technology starting to emerge more here, and I hear that more on the show floor even, amongst our friends and competitors, partners and competitors. We're all kind of dealing with that. How do we make this new world work? I think that would be the biggest trend that at least I'm paying attention to. It's also increased the partnership between, the very giant tech companies that all of us in the AV industry always wanted to get closer to for ideas and things we thought we could do better together with Microsoft, Zoom, Google, and now look, they all saved the day too, right? When it came to all of us being able to work remotely. And now they're seeing this shift back to the office. And now there's even more of a imprint of, man, I had a great experience on Teams at home. But man, I went back to the office last week, the first time, and man, that conference room really did not do well. And oh man, the people joining from home, they never got a chance to talk, get a word in edgewise, because all of us were busy in the meeting doing our thing. That creates that whole question about meeting equity and how do we do that. I think that's another big trend, is I think you're going to see more engagement from Microsoft, Zoom, Google, maybe other players. There's Cisco WebEx too, of course, not to forget them. They're all going to get even more traction, I think, with all of us in collaborating and partnering on technology plays, but solutioning. How do we make these experiences better? Because all of us now, whether we realize it or not, have been imprinted with a much better user experience, I think at least, from working from home, and Teams or Zoom, whatever your platform of choice, has worked so well that then you go back to the office and you're like, man, this really exposes how not so great this has been working. So I think that's going to put pressure in a good way on those big partners you see here at the show even, and all of us to come closer together. And I think that's going to do a lot for our tech. It's going to do a lot for diversity. It's a big fabric. It all works together. And I think that's my perspective, I guess.